Snow fell in soft, measured flakes over Philadelphia that morning, blanketing the streets in a quiet calm that belied the storm brewing inside the federal courthouse. The building stood like a sentinel of history, its stone facade catching the dim winter light, with Independence Hall just a short walk away. The air was cold enough to nip at noses and turn breaths into visible puffs. Inside, however, the air was warm but tense, filled with the low hum of voices, the occasional shuffle of papers, and the metallic clink of a gavel being set down. Naomi Carter sat on the worn wooden bench in the front row, legs swinging just above the marble floor. Her lavender knit cardigan, buttoned all the way up, contrasted sharply with the dark suits and heavy coats around her. At 10 years old, she didn't quite fit the picture of who might be present at a high-stakes federal trial. But she was here, tucked beside her mother, Danielle Carter, who had been called to testify later in the day. Danielle's eyes were forward, fixed on the judge's bench, her posture straight but tense. She had warned Naomi on the walk over, don't speak unless spoken to, and even then, keep it brief. This was no place for chatter. Naomi had nodded obediently then, but her curious mind had already started working the moment they stepped inside. Judge William Harper sat in his high-backed chair, a man in his late 50s with silvering hair and a presence that commanded attention without raising his voice. Draped in the traditional black robe, he adjusted a sleek smartwatch on his wrist, tapping its face lightly with one finger while listening to the attorneys argue over procedural matters. Naomi's gaze drifted over the courtroom. She noticed the neat rows of benches, the elevated witness stand, and the gallery packed with reporters holding tablets and notepads. She saw the tiny blinking lights on the wall-mounted cameras, the faint glow of the microphones embedded in the judge's desk, and the digital display above the clerk's table. Most people ignored these details. Naomi didn't. Her eyes returned to Judge Harper's smartwatch. There it was again, a blink, too quick and irregular, almost like it was winking at her. She tilted her head, studying the rhythm. It didn't match the steady pulse of a typical notification light. Something about it made her small brow furrow. She leaned slightly toward her mother, but Danielle's hand tightened on hers, a silent reminder to stay put. Naomi's eyes darted back to the bench. She bit her lip, then made a decision. While the defense attorney droned on about a motion to dismiss, Naomi slid quietly off the bench, her sneakers barely making a sound on the polished floor. She approached the bench with slow, careful steps, her small frame almost hidden between the towering bodies of court officers. When she reached the side of the bench, she looked up at Judge Harper, who glanced down at her with a puzzled expression. She rose onto her tiptoes, leaned in close enough that only he could hear, and whispered, "There's a bug in your watch." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Harper blinked, as if unsure he had heard correctly. "Excuse me?" he murmured, his voice low. Naomi simply pointed to his wrist. "It's not just telling time," she said softly. "It's listening." A couple of staff members nearby chuckled under their breath. One attorney rolled his eyes, clearly amused by the interruption. But Harper didn't laugh. There was something in Naomi's tone, calm, certain, that made him still his hand over the watch. Before he could ask more, the overhead lights flickered. Once, twice. The large screen behind the witness stand glitched, the image distorting into jagged lines before going black. A murmur rose from the gallery. Harper's eyes narrowed as he tapped the watch again, but the display remained frozen. Naomi stepped back without another word and returned to her seat, sliding in next to her mother as if nothing had happened. Danielle shot her a questioning look, but Naomi only shrugged. The rest of the morning session carried on, but Judge Harper's focus was fractured. His mind replayed those 6 quiet words, "There's a bug in your watch," over and over, each repetition weighing heavier than the last. By the time the recess was called, Harper found himself staring at the watch as though it were an unfamiliar object. He had handled federal cases involving fraud, corporate espionage, and organized crime, yet never had a child's whisper rattled him like this. Naomi, meanwhile, swung her legs idly, glancing occasionally at the ceiling lights and wall panels as though she were watching some private show only she could understand. The faintest smile tugged at the corner of her mouth when one of the microphones blinked just slightly off rhythm. Harper didn't miss it. As court reconvened, the weather outside had turned harsher, wind howling down Market Street, rattling the old courthouse windows. Inside, however, the real chill wasn't from the cold. It was the subtle, creeping sense that something unseen was moving beneath the surface of this trial. Naomi knew it. Harper suspected it. And in that silent understanding between a judge and a 10-year-old girl, the first thread of a larger truth had been pulled. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the glass panes in Judge William Harper's chambers as the courthouse emptied for the day. The warmth of the small office contrasted sharply with the cold draft seeping through the old brick walls. On his desk, stacks of briefs and case files sat neatly arranged, but his attention was fixed on one object, a black, sleek smartwatch lying face down on a legal pad. He stared at it for a long while, as if it might start blinking again under his gaze. Harper had worn that watch for over a year, a gift from his son last Christmas. It was supposed to be convenient, efficient, a way to check notifications without pulling out his phone. But now, every flicker in his memory seemed suspicious. He reached for the phone on his desk, punching in a number he hadn't used in months. It rang twice before a steady, deep voice answered. "Ethan Miles." "It's Harper," the judge said quietly. "I need you to come in. Now, bring your kit." There was no hesitation on the other end. "I'll be there in 20. Harper hung up and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He was not an impulsive man. Years on the bench had trained him to weigh facts, consider angles, and avoid jumping to conclusions. But this wasn't a legal argument. It was a gut feeling, sharpened by the look in a child's eyes. 25 minutes later, Ethan Miles stepped into the chambers, shrugging off his heavy coat. He was a tall man in his early 40s with close-cropped hair, and the kind of calm, methodical demeanor Harper had trusted during several sensitive investigations back in his days as a federal prosecutor. Without a word, Harper slid the watch across the desk. "Run a quiet scan. Don't log it in any official system." Ethan raised an eyebrow but nodded. He unzipped a small black case, pulling out a portable analyzer that unfolded into a metal tray with tiny ports and blinking indicators. He placed the watch on it and connected a cable. The device hummed softly, lights chasing one another in a diagnostic pattern. For 30 minutes, Harper busied himself with reviewing motions, though his eyes kept drifting toward the analyzer. When Ethan finally looked up, his expression was grave. "This isn't a glitch," he said flatly. "There's unauthorized firmware installed. Someone's using this as a surveillance node. It's been sending encrypted packets to a masked remote server." Harper felt his stomach tighten. "You're telling me I was bugged? In court?" Ethan's silence was answer enough. "Not just you," Ethan added after a beat. "If the signal fingerprints match others I've seen, this could mean the courtroom's entire tech infrastructure is compromised." The judge's gaze dropped to the watch, now nothing more than a sleek, silent piece of evidence. He had faced powerful corporations before, but this felt different, more invasive, more personal. After Ethan left, Harper sat in the dim light of his desk lamp, the muffled roar of the wind filling the room. He considered his options. Calling the marshal's office was the standard protocol, but if the breach ran as deep as Ethan suggested, there was no telling who else might be listening. Instead, he reached for his coat. The streets of Philadelphia glistened under a thin layer of ice as he drove through the night, the rhythmic swish of the wipers matching the steady beat of his thoughts. His destination was an unlisted row house on a quiet side street, a place he hadn't been in years, but whose address he'd never forgotten. Danielle Carter answered the door in a thick cardigan, her hair pulled back loosely. Surprise flickered across her face when she saw him. "Judge Harper?" "Danielle," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "We need to talk. It's about your daughter." Her brow furrowed, but she stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. Inside, the living room was warm and modestly decorated, the faint scent of cinnamon in the air. Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor, a puzzle spread out before her. "Naomi's different," Danielle began after they'd settled into the kitchen, her voice low. "She notices things, patterns. She can look at digital signals the way other kids look at cartoons." Harper glanced toward the living room, where Naomi was now fitting two oddly shaped pieces together with quiet satisfaction. "She told me there was a bug in my watch," he said. "She was right." Danielle's eyes darkened. "I've seen it before. Years ago, I found hidden code in my company's software. My phone started blinking when it wasn't supposed to. Lights on devices flickered out of sync. That was Sloan Tech. And when I reported it, I lost my job." Harper leaned forward. "Your daughter saw my watch blink once. That's all it took?" Danielle hesitated, then called softly, "Naomi, honey?" The girl padded into the kitchen, her socks making no sound on the hardwood floor. She looked from her mother to the judge, then spoke with the same calm certainty as she had in court. "Your watch flashed when it wasn't supposed to," she said simply. "It's in the lights, too, and the speakers. The wall panel behind the witness box. They all blink wrong." Harper stared at her, not because her words sounded implausible, but because they made perfect sense. Danielle's voice was barely above a whisper. "If she saw it, Judge, you should be worried." Harper left that night with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. He would not ignore the quiet warning of a child who could see what the rest of them couldn't. The next morning, Philadelphia woke to a sky the color of steel and the slow, deliberate fall of snowflakes over Market Street. Inside a narrow cafe just 2 blocks from the courthouse, the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of cinnamon rolls. The glass windows fogged from the warmth inside, blurring the view of bundled pedestrians hurrying past. Judge William Harper sat at a corner table, his overcoat draped neatly over the chair behind him. Across from him, Danielle Carter cupped her hands around a steaming mug, her eyes scanning the room before settling on him. Beside her, Naomi sat with a cup of hot chocolate, the whipped cream melting into swirls. Naomi was quiet, but Harper could tell her eyes were busy. They flicked to the blinking register display, the little green light on the cafe's security camera, even the charging port for the espresso machine. She was cataloging, comparing, measuring, though she never looked long enough to seem nosy. "Thank you for meeting me," Harper began, leaning forward slightly. Danielle nodded. "You sounded concerned." "I am," he admitted. "Ethan confirmed my watch was transmitting data to a remote server, encrypted, masked, exactly the kind of thing you warned me about." Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's Sloan Tech's signature. I've seen it before." Naomi looked up from her hot chocolate. "I saw it yesterday, too," she said matter-of-factly. "Not just your watch. The big screen behind you blinks wrong. The microphones, the panel by the witness stand, they all do." Harper studied her for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small notepad and set it on the table. "Show me." Without hesitation, Naomi took the pen and began sketching. Her lines were confident, quick. An outline of the courtroom emerged on the page. She marked each camera, each microphone, each panel, adding tiny dots where the lights had blinked out of rhythm. Danielle watched quietly. "She's been like this since she was little. When she was 6, she figured out the baby monitor we had was broadcasting on an open channel. She couldn't explain it in technical terms, but she knew something was wrong." Naomi slid the notepad back to Harper. The diagram was simple, but every mark felt intentional. "This," Harper said, tapping the page, "could be the key to proving the breach." Danielle lowered her voice. "Then we need to move fast. If Sloan Tech knows you're looking, they'll wipe the evidence." From the counter, the barista called out an order, the sound breaking the brief silence at their table. Harper sat back, thinking. "If I bring this to the marshals, it might get buried. We need an independent copy of whatever data they're collecting. Ethan can help, but I'll need access without raising suspicion." Naomi's eyes lit with a spark of determination. "I can map the blink patterns during the trial. If the devices talk to each other, I'll know." Harper smiled faintly, though there was worry in his eyes. "That's a big risk, Naomi." she shrugged. So is letting them keep spying. Danielle reached out, resting a protective hand on her daughter's arm. We'll be careful. But if she's right, this isn't just about one trial. This could be happening in courtrooms all over the country. Outside, a gust of wind blew snow against the window, the flakes catching in the glow of the streetlights. Harper slipped the notepad into his coat pocket, feeling the weight of what it represented. They left the cafe together, parting ways at the corner. Harper walked toward the courthouse, the cold air biting at his cheeks, the diagram in his pocket like a secret map. He knew they were stepping into dangerous territory, but for the first time since Naomi had whispered to him, he felt like they might have a chance to win. The morning of the pivotal testimony dawned cold and brittle, the kind of winter day in Philadelphia where the air seemed to crack with each breath. The courthouse loomed against the pale sky, its stone pillars dusted with snow, the steps swept clean but slick underfoot. Inside, the heat hissed from old radiators, fighting back the chill that clung to coats and scarves. Judge William Harper stood at the front of the nearly empty courtroom, his robe hanging from a hook behind the bench. Instead of his usual morning review of case notes, he was checking each piece of equipment with quiet, deliberate movements. The large wall screen was unplugged. The wireless microphones had been replaced with wired ones from storage, their cords curling across the floor like sleeping snakes. An old tape recorder, one of the clunky models with big physical buttons, sat under his desk, its red record light ready but hidden from view. Ethan Miles had been there an hour earlier, helping him set up. "This will work," Ethan had said in his measured tone. "But keep in mind, if the source is inside Sloan Tech, they'll notice the feed has changed." "That's the point," Harper replied. "I want them nervous." By the time the court officers began filing in, the room had been transformed. It still looked modern enough to pass casual inspection, but the most vulnerable tech was now offline. To anyone else, it would seem like a temporary glitch or maintenance day. Danielle Carter arrived just before the first session, her coat still dusted with snow. Naomi walked beside her, clutching a small spiral notebook. She caught Harper's eye and gave a barely perceptible nod before taking her seat in the front row. The hum of conversation grew as lawyers filtered in, reporters claiming their usual spots. The energy was different, charged, anticipatory. Today was the testimony of Gregory Sloan, CEO of Sloan Tech Systems, and the gallery was packed to see him in person. He entered like a man stepping onto a stage he owned, tall, well-groomed, a charcoal suit cut to perfection. His hair was slicked back, his cufflinks gleaming. He shook hands with his attorney, offering the kind of confident smile that photographs well in the business section of a newspaper. Harper watched him from the bench, his expression neutral. But he noticed the subtle way Sloane's gaze flicked toward the cameras and microphones, the very ones Naomi had marked in her diagram. Even unplugged, their casings remained in place, and Harper saw the faintest tightening at the corner of Sloane's jaw. The opening questions from the prosecutor were straightforward. Company history, basic operations. Sloane's answers were smooth, polished, threaded with corporate jargon that sounded reassuring if you didn't listen too closely. Naomi did listen. Her eyes tracked every blink of the indicator lights, every shift in Sloane's tone when certain devices in the room responded. At one point she leaned toward her mother and whispered, "Top left camera. Blinking wrong." Danielle squeezed her hand, but kept her eyes on the witness stand. Harper, meanwhile, glanced toward the Federal Observer sitting quietly in the back. A subtle nod passed between them. As the questioning continued, Harper took note of the moments when Sloane seemed just a fraction too aware of his surroundings, when his eyes darted toward the witness stand panel, or when he hesitated mid-answer as if listening for something else. The defense began their cross-examination, painting Sloan Tech as a pioneer in digital safety and portraying the accusations as the work of misinformed whistleblowers. Sloane smiled faintly at this, glancing toward Danielle in the gallery, as though she were nothing more than a footnote in his company's success story. Naomi's pencil scratched quickly across her notebook. She wasn't writing words. She was drawing sequences, dots and dashes that mapped the blink patterns in real time. Harper noticed the movement, and when she looked up, their eyes met for just a moment. She tilted her head slightly, as if to say, "It's happening now." The session reached a natural pause, and Harper called for a short recess. Lawyers clustered around their clients. Reporters slipped into the hall to send quick updates. Naomi stayed seated, her hands folded over the notebook. When court resumed, the room felt even more taut, like a rope pulled just short of snapping. Harper's voice carried its usual calm authority, but underneath was a current of intent. "Mr. Sloan," he said evenly, "you've assured this court your company prioritizes security above all else. Would you say that applies to all environments, including those under federal jurisdiction?" "Absolutely, Your Honor," Sloan replied without hesitation. Naomi watched him closely. The lights on the panel behind him blinked twice in quick succession. She didn't smile, but her pencil tapped once against her notebook. Harper leaned back slightly in his chair. "Good. Then I trust you'll have no objection to certain measures we've taken today to ensure the integrity of these proceedings." For the first time, Sloane's expression faltered. Just a hair, just enough for Harper to know they'd rattled him. The trap was set. The afternoon session began under a hush that didn't match the number of people in the courtroom. Every seat was taken, but it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, snow fell in thicker sheets now, the gray light filtering through the tall windows and casting the room in a muted glow. Judge William Harper took his seat at the bench, a folder of neatly stacked papers before him. Beneath the desk, the old cassette recorder sat silently, its little wheels turning. Naomi Carter watched from the front row, her small spiral notebook balanced on her knees. She had been mapping blink patterns all day, her eyes sharper than any camera in the room. On the witness stand, Gregory Sloan adjusted his suit jacket, leaning toward the microphone. His confidence was intact, at least on the surface. "Your Honor," he began as the defense attorney prompted him, "Sloan Tech Systems has always operated with the utmost respect for privacy and security. We innovate for protection, not intrusion." Harper's gaze didn't waver. "And you categorically deny any involvement in unauthorized surveillance within this courtroom?" "Absolutely," Sloan said, the word ringing with feigned sincerity. Naomi looked up from her notebook. The panel lights blinked twice, then once, a pattern she'd been tracking all morning. Her hand tightened around her pencil. The prosecutor rose for redirect, sliding a sheet of paper onto the podium. "Mr. Sloan, are you aware of any Sloan Tech employees with access to this courthouse's internal systems?" Sloan's smile was almost lazy. "I am not." It was then Naomi stood. No one had called her name. No one expected her to move. But she rose with a steady calm, her boots making the faintest thump against the floor as she stepped into the aisle. Danielle's hand lifted slightly, as if to stop her, but Naomi kept walking. Down the long center aisle, past rows of startled faces, until she stood just a few feet from the bench. "May I speak, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice clear and unwavering. The courtroom stilled. The defense attorney sputtered, "This is highly irregular." Harper lifted a hand, silencing the room. His eyes softened slightly as he looked at Naomi. "Come forward." She climbed the short steps to the bench, the spiral notebook still in her hands. From inside it, she pulled a single sheet of printed paper and held it out. Harper took it, his eyes scanning the header, signal log analysis, before moving to the columns of timestamps and device IDs. "This," Naomi said, "is from your speaker system. It recorded private conversations you had with the bailiff last week, even though you thought the system was off." A ripple went through the room, reporters leaning forward, attorneys exchanging glances. Harper's hands stilled halfway down the page. His own words were there in black and white, fragments of conversations never meant to leave his chambers. He looked up, thunderstruck. "How did you—" Naomi's voice lowered, but every syllable carried. "The blink patterns told me where the data was hiding." Across the courtroom, Sloane's face hardened. "Your Honor, "This is absurd. You're allowing a child to—" The gavel slammed against the bench so hard the sound echoed like a crack of ice. Silence. Harper's voice had lost all trace of softness. "This child just proved my courtroom has been compromised." Chaos erupted, reporters scrambling for cameras, lawyers speaking over one another, murmurs swelling into shouts. Through it all, Harper's focus never left Sloan. "We will recess immediately," Harper announced, rising from his chair. "Federal cybersecurity officers will take control of this proceeding. This trial is no longer under local jurisdiction." Two men in dark suits, silent, efficient, entered from the rear, moving toward the bench. Naomi stepped back to the aisle, returning to her seat beside her mother. Danielle's eyes were bright, though she kept her expression composed. From the gallery, it was clear something irreversible had just happened. The confident CEO who had walked in that morning was gone. In his place sat a man whose mask had cracked. As the federal officers conferred quietly with Harper, Sloan leaned toward his attorney, his jaw tight. Naomi watched him without blinking, the paper still in Harper's hands. For the rest of the afternoon, no one looked at Naomi like just a child. They looked at her with the kind of stunned reverence reserved for someone who had just changed the outcome of a battle. When the gavel finally struck again, Harper's voice was steady, but beneath it ran a current of steel. "Due to unlawful surveillance, obstruction of justice, and breach of federal protocols, these proceedings are suspended pending a special investigation. Sloan Tech Systems is now the subject of federal criminal charges." He stepped down from the bench, moving past Sloan without a glance, and stopped in front of Naomi. His voice softened enough for only those nearby to hear. "You reminded us that justice doesn't just come from authority. Sometimes it comes from innocence, from courage, from a whisper." The words landed in the room like a final chord, resonating even after the echo faded. Snow had begun to pile in soft drifts along the courthouse steps, the flakes swirling under the yellow glow of the street lamps. The late afternoon light was fading, and with it, the hum of the day's chaos was settling into a strange, heavy quiet. Inside, the last of the reporters filed out, their voices low, as if they were leaving the scene of something sacred. Judge William Harper emerged from his chambers without his robe, wearing only a dark overcoat buttoned up against the cold. The usual briefcase was absent. In his hand he carried nothing but the old cassette recorder, its tape now wound to the end. His face bore the calm of a man who had done what needed to be done, though the weight of the day still showed in the set of his jaw. At the far end of the hallway, Naomi and Danielle waited. Danielle's scarf was wrapped high against the chill, her arm resting gently around her daughter's shoulders. Naomi's lavender cardigan peeked out from under her coat, a small defiance against the winter gray. They walked together toward the doors, but before they stepped outside, Harper caught up to them. The bustle of the departing crowd faded as he spoke. "This courtroom has been betrayed," he said, his voice steady, but carrying the kind of raw truth that silences a room. "Not just by a company, but by those who were supposed to protect our truth." Danielle met his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. Harper's eyes shifted to Naomi. She looked down for a moment, almost shy, but when she looked up again, there was a flicker of pride there. "A 10-year-old saw what none of us could," Harper continued. "She saw the pattern. She saw the lie, and she chose to speak." Naomi's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. Outside, snow tapped softly against the tall glass doors, as if urging them to step into the cold. When they finally did, the winter air wrapped around them like a bracing truth, sharp but honest. On the courthouse steps, the crowd had thinned, leaving behind only a few curious passers-by and the faint echo of camera shutters. The Independence Hall clock chimed in the distance, marking the hour with a clear, resonant tone. A pair of black SUVs idled at the curb, federal agents moving briskly between them, their breath visible in the frosty air. Inside one of them, Gregory Sloan sat behind tinted glass, his profile just visible before the door shut and the vehicle pulled away. Naomi didn't watch him go. Instead, she tilted her head back, letting a snowflake melt on her cheek. Danielle squeezed her shoulder gently. Harper stepped down beside them, his boots crunching in the thin layer of ice. "You've done something today, Naomi," he said. "Something most adults never have the courage to do." She shrugged lightly, her voice almost a whisper. "I just didn't want them to get away with it." A small smile touched Harper's lips. That's how every fight for justice starts. For a moment, they stood together, the three of them, as the snow continued to fall. Quiet, persistent, relentless, just like the truth Naomi had carried into that courtroom. Then Danielle took Naomi's hand, and they began to walk down the steps, their footprints trailing behind them in the fresh snow. At the bottom, Naomi paused. She glanced back at the courthouse, its windows glowing softly against the winter dusk. "I knew you'd listen," she said softly, almost to herself. And then they turned the corner, disappearing into the swirl of snow and holiday lights, leaving the courthouse standing solemn and still, a witness to the fact that justice, once spoken, can never be unheard. The courthouse was quiet now, its grand hallways echoing only with the distant sound of footsteps fading into the winter night. Outside, the snow continued to fall in soft waves, wrapping Philadelphia in a blanket of stillness. Yet, for those who had been inside earlier that day, the memory of what happened remained vivid, clearer perhaps than the bite of the cold. Naomi Carter, a 10-year-old girl from the Black community, had stepped into that courtroom with no title, no authority, and no reason to believe her voice would be heard. And yet, armed only with her observations and her courage, she exposed a truth that grown men with power and influence had failed to see. In doing so, she reminded everyone present that justice is not born from status or wealth, but from integrity and the willingness to speak when it matters most. For Judge William Harper, the day had been a stark reminder that even the most experienced eyes can be blinded by routine. It took the innocence and clarity of a child, one often overlooked in the larger conversations of power, to point him toward the truth. And for the Black community watching from afar, Naomi's actions stood as proof that the quiet strength within their neighborhoods carries the power to challenge injustice at its highest levels. The lesson here is simple, but not easy. Hold on to your dignity and stand up for the truth in ways that are calm, steady, and rooted in respect. There is no need for shouting to make a difference. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room can change the course of events entirely. As the Black community knows well from its long history of resilience, true change often begins with a single act of courage, multiplied when others choose to listen. In our everyday lives, we may not find ourselves in federal court, but we all face moments where something feels wrong, where a blink, a pause, or a pattern doesn't add up. It's in those moments that we must decide. Will we stay silent, or will we find the courage to speak, even if our voice shakes? Like a lantern glowing in the window on a winter night, a simple act of truth-telling can guide us through the darkest corridors of injustice. Naomi's whisper was that light, a reminder that the fight for fairness is not the responsibility of the powerful alone, but of each of us who believes in what is right. If this story touched your heart, share it. Let it be a spark in your own circle, a reminder that change often comes from unexpected places. And the next time you see someone overlooked, remember, their perspective might just be the key to uncovering the truth we all need to hear.